Hi, glad to see you on my channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It's important to me. Have a good view. In October 1944, the Allied armies reached the borders of the Third Reich, but a burgeoning supply crisis prevented them from continuing their offensive on a broad front. In the badly damaged harbors of northern France and Belgium, temporary berths and auxiliary watercraft capable of providing rapid transshipment of supplies for the front were badly needed. At the same time, the need for landing ships in Europe has significantly reduced, which allowed to begin their transfer for action in the Indian and Pacific Oceans against Japan. For these reasons, from both sides of the Atlantic came two counter-convoys, which were united by one feature. They had a large number of coastal ships going in tow. This circumstance was fatal in one of the strongest storms of the war. The New Appian Way. The first plans for the transfer of landing ships from European waters to the Indian Ocean began to be worked out in Great Britain in February 1944. The program and the committee in charge of its development and implementation were named Appian, after the famous Roman Appian Way. In theory, the 650-ton LCT Yank III ships planned for transfer had a fairly respectable range of 2,700 miles. But sending them on an independent long-distance voyage was initially recognized as dangerous and impractical. Because of their peculiar design, the paratroopers were not characterized by good seaworthiness, and their engines would have used up much of their life during such a passage. It was decided to tow the ships by merchant ships as part of convoys to Gibraltar, from where they were to sail to Malta and Alexandria. After training at the Middle East Combined Operations Training Center on Little Bitter Lake in Egypt, the LCTs were again to make the passage to Bombay on a tug as part of convoys. This did not mean that all that was left was to dispatch the ships destined for redeployment. Comprehensive tests were carried out to see how the LCTs would behave on a tug of different types and in different weather conditions, and to determine the necessary measures to complete and retrofit them. Specifically for LCT Menke 3, it was clearly stated that the maximum sea excitement for them is 4 points on the Beaufort scale: moderate wind, wave height up to 2 meters, regulated actions in case of weather deterioration. Each convoy was ordered to allocate a tanker, a floating workshop, and 3 tugs. At the very first meeting of the Appian Committee, it was decided that in order to avoid severe winter storms in the Bay of Biscay and monsoons in the Indian Ocean from October to March, the transfer of ships should not be carried out. However, in reality, it turned out to be only a good wish. Considerations of military necessity proved to be more important than safety. The first to relocate to the Far East appointed the 9th Landing Flotilla. This was a well-deserved Mediterranean connection, which took part in the landing in Sicily and Salerno. After transfer to European waters, the flotilla was enrolled in the Combined Reserve. It was based in Belfast and did not take part in the Normandy landings, although this refers more to its number in the staff schedule. The composition of the compound was constantly shuffled, and on the day D in the flotilla was no longer a single ship veterans of the Mediterranean Sea. At the end of August 1944, for staffing and preparation of ships for the transition flotilla relocated to Glasgow. First of all, the forward ramp and the forward cut-off bulkhead protecting it were temporarily welded up on the troopers. On the landing, tank deck, empty 200-liter barrels were placed around the cargoes, and then the whole stack was rigidly fastened to the sides with 10-centimeter steel straps. The deck itself with barrels, in fact, the main hold of the ship opened from above, was covered with 2 layers of tarpaulin. The bulkheads and underwalls in the living quarters were covered with cork insulation. The regular crew of the LCT Menke 3 consisted of 12 men, 2 officers, and 10 lower ranks, but they were manned with at least 3 more lower ranks for the transition, and some ships took 6 additional sailors or specialists. To accommodate the overstaffed crew members, simple wooden bunks were set up on the same tank deck with empty barrels. As of October 9, 1944, the 9th Flotilla was manned at full strength, 12 ships, and included LCT 478, LCT 480, LCT 488, LCT 489, LCT 491, LCT-492, LCT-493, LCT-494, LCT-7014, LCT-7015, LCT-7022, and LCT-723, the last four belonging to the improved LCT-MK3 series. Only 2 ships had an operational status of A, fully ready, while the rest were still in C status, technical work lasting 72 hours or more. Because of the great rush and strain on ship repair facilities, the ships were scattered in various harbors along the west coast: Glasgow, Troon, Ayr, Irvine. But by 14th October, the flotilla was concentrated in 2 main starting points, Glasgow and Liverpool, the demise of the 9th Flotilla. The fate of the tug Pioneer on the Appian Way of the fleet fell to the convoy KMS 66 Great Britain, Gibraltar, the main part of which was to leave Glasgow and go south down the Irish Sea, joining on the way groups of ships from Belfast, Liverpool, and Milford Haven. At Liverpool, KMS 66 was joined by a small OS 92 Great Britain Freetown convoy of 10 ships, and they were to proceed in a single order to Gibraltar. Escort Group B-23 of Lieutenant Commander George E. Newey's Escort Group B-23, consisting of the sloop HMS Fowey, the corvettes HMS Knaresborough Castle and HMS Allington Castle, provided protection. The main part of convoy KMS 66, led by Commodore Franklin Ratsey, began pulling out of the mouth of the Clyde at 1945 GMT on October 14th. Weather conditions were already poor, and the acceptance of landing craft in tow took longer than planned. The largest ships of the convoy were assigned as tugboats. The steamer Samfoil took LCT-488 and LCT-489 in tow, Fort Finley, 7134 BT, LCT-491 and LCT-7015, and City of Lions, only LCT-480, as the flagship LCT-492 broke off the eye-bolt and had to return to port. Maintaining a minimum speed of 6 knots due to the tugs, KMS 66 began her leisurely journey southward, joining the rest of the convoy. On the morning of October 15th, the convoy was joined by ships that had left Belfast and 3 submarines that were to make the passage to Gibraltar in a surface position: HMS Thrasher, HMS Trident, and HMS Sea Scout. At 07:45 on October 16th, OS 92 set out to rendezvous with KMS 66, with Ocean Vanity, 7174 BT towing LCT 7022 and LCT 7023, and Nairnbank, 5156 BT towing LCT 494 and LCT 7014. On board LCT 494 was Lieutenant John Mertz, who took command of the flotilla on the crossing. The OS 92 escort ships had liaison officers on board who were to be handed over to the troop carriers out of the Clyde, but this could not be done due to increasing sea agitation. At 11:50 the same day, the last ships from Milford Haven joined the convoy, and the finally formed KMS 66 with 9 landing craft of the 9th Flotilla in tow entered St. George's Strait, beyond which the Atlantic was already opening. On October 17th, it continued to storm and LCT 488 was reported to be in trouble, but the crew and ship would hold out unless the weather worsened. Commodore Frank Ratsey asked Lieutenant Mertz over the VHF comms how his charges were doing and received a curmudgeonly reply: "We're doing okay so far, but the weather is very rough." Alas, the storm steadily continued to intensify. And when on the morning of October 18th the convoy reached Cape Land's End, which translates as the edge of the world, the ocean met the ships with a real hurricane. This cape already had a bad reputation among sailors of landing flotillas. On November 14th, 1943, in the same area, in the storm, sank LCT 333, LCT 343, and LCT 385. At 10:20 a.m. on October 18th, Escort Commander George Newey got in touch with Commodore Ratsey and suggested that he give the order to the tugboats to lay adrift, to which he immediately agreed. And the order was relayed to the merchant ships. But disaster was imminent, and at 10:50, the Nairnbank reported that the flagship LCT 494 had broken off and contact had been lost with her. The corvette Ellington Castle was ordered to proceed immediately to search for the ship and render assistance. At 11:12 a.m., radiograms went out to the Admiralty and Western Approaches Command for urgent assistance. Both Ratsey and Fowey had already realized that this was the beginning of the end. Even the larger vessels were beginning to take damage and fall out of the convoy order. At 12:35 p.m., LCT 7022 reported a leak, and the crew was preparing to evacuate. At 1340, City of Lions reported that LCT-480 was taking on water, and 10 minutes later, the loud calls for help from Lieutenant Murtez of the missing LCT-494 broke through the airwaves. LCT-7015 and LCT-491 broke away from Fort Finley and disappeared. On the stranded troopers, hurricane winds tore the double tarpaulin that covered the holds, tore down the bunks and cargoes, which crushed the sides. From the impact of the waves crumbled stacked stacks of barrels on the decks. Pumps and fuel lines were out of order. At 1420, the transport Samfoil lost her wards. LCT-489 disappeared, and LCT-488 was still holding near the corvette Knaresborough Castle, which was covering her. LCT-7014 broke away from the Nairnbank with engines stalled. By this time, the Admiralty had already sent to the aid of all ships and vessels in the area. By order of the commander of the western approaches to the convoy, in distress, went ships from the escort groups of convoys, ON 260, HX 312, MKF 35. The radio station of Cape Land's End was continuously calling the ships of the landing flotilla. The rescue operation continued through the night and all of the next 24 hours on October 19th. The Admiralty ordered that no attempt should be made to salvage the discovered landing craft, but to sink them, removing the crew. On the night of October 19th, Ellington Castle rescued survivors and sank LCT-480 and LCT-491, while Knaresborough Castle massacred LCT-488. The rescue of sailors from the troop carriers took place under the most difficult conditions, and casualties appeared in the crews of the corvettes as well. The men from the LCT had to jump into the raging sea, where they were fished out and pulled up to the thrown-out side nets by roped sailors from the corvettes. All the escort ships' lifeboats were lost almost immediately. The rescue ship Dundee of convoy ON 260 located the sinking LCT-7014 and removed survivors from it. The corvette HMS King's Cup removed crews from the damaged LCT-7022 and LCT-7023, but did not sink them. In the general turmoil, the submarine Trident, which did not show up in the convoy order until 15 HAL on October 19th, was also listed as missing. A total of 55 men died, 4 ships sank, 2 were missing, and nearly 100 sailors were rescued. The search for the missing LCT continued until October 23rd. On October 22nd, LCT-7022 and LCT-7023, which had been left without crews, were found and towed to Falmouth. The crew of LCT-489, which was thought to be lost, showed amazing seamanship, but managed to beat the hurricane and make it to Falmouth on its own. The 3 ships subsequently served in the newly formed 9th Flotilla in India. The crews of the missing LCT-494 and LCT-7015 were recognized as a complete loss of life. Immediately after the events described, commissions of inquiry were set up in Gibraltar and Liverpool. The members of the Admiralty Commission in Gibraltar reached a verdict that Commodore Ratsay was largely responsible for what had happened. He should have turned the convoy back on course on the evening of October 17th, when a critical deterioration in the weather was clearly imminent. It was also noted that more thorough preparation of ships for the towing, strengthened escort, and technical escort were required. The actions of the escort ships were considered excellent, with the corvette Ellington Castle being particularly commended. Liverpool came to similar conclusions regarding the more careful equipment of the ships, but in the end, a radical decision was made to abandon towing as part of merchant convoys altogether. Now the landing ships were to make crossings along the Appian Way independently, in large groups. These operations were called voyages. The first voyage, A, set off on November 15, 1944. The reconstituted 9th Flotilla went to Burma in February 1945 as part of the Flight E. It involved a total of 36 ships from 4 flotillas. This time, the weather forecast was given increased attention. The voyage should have left as early as January 19th, but it was postponed due to severe storms in the Bay of Biscay. Unfortunately, the pioneers of the route were not so lucky. The epic of the tug convoy NY-119. On the west coast of the Atlantic, the fall of 1944 was also marked by strong storms, but this was not unusual. The hurricane season here has been known since the time of the discoverers of America. In 1944, for the first time, American forecasters were able to accurately record all the hurricanes of the Western Atlantic and their strength, using automatic radio sondes transmitting telemetry from the very upper layers of the troposphere. The season began on July 15th and continued through November 15th, with the fall storms being the most severe. The greatest damage was caused by the so-called Great Atlantic Hurricane of 1944, which raged from September 9 to 15. Damage on the U.S. coast was estimated at $100 million from the composition of the Navy, with heavy casualties among the crews of the destroyer Warrington, Coast Guard cutters Bedloe and Jackson, minesweeper YMC 409. Having made trouble off the coast of America, the hurricane raced to the central Atlantic, where it merged with the cyclone zone southwest of Greenland, waiting for the next victim. Meanwhile, on the Western Front in Europe, a logistical crisis was brewing. Even before the Normandy landings in the Allied headquarters during the discussion of the problems of supplying the landed troops, suggested the need to use non-self-propelled railroad ferries and oil barges for the fastest possible delivery of goods to the troops. Firstly, these ferries, which were widely used in the major commercial ports of the time, were ideal for delivering supplies together with transport or transport itself. And secondly, they could be used as temporary berths in artificial harbors. A favorable decision was made, despite the resistance of ferry owners and the high demand of the Port of New York for such watercraft. In the early spring of 1944, the government requisitioned 12 ferries and 12 barges, which 12 U.S. Army LT tugs pulled to England in 21 days. As Rear Admiral Edmund J. Moran, who was in charge of harbor services for the invasion front, noted, the risks were great, but everything went relatively safely that time. The U.S. Army also ordered a large number of two 12-ton Type ST tugs to operate in artificial harbors, but at first they were moved across the Atlantic on the decks of cargo ships. By their characteristics, they could operate only in closed waters. When in September 1944, the front stood up because of the supply crisis, there was no time to choose the weather, persuade ship owners, and safe transportation. Ferries and tugs were urgently needed. As soon as possible formed a convoy NY-119, which on September 19th, 5 days after the Great Hurricane went into the Atlantic, followed him to the coast of England. The convoy consisted of 14 railroad ferries, on which 12 wooden cargo lighters were loaded on top, as well as 12 LT seagoing tugs, 15 ST small tugs, 1 Panamanian transport, 2 British net tenders, and the Navy tanker USS Maumee. Task Group 27.5, consisting of 5 American destroyers, USS O'Toole, USS Birmingham, USS Edgar G. Chase, USS Mason, and USS John J. Powers, carried convoy security. The larger and more powerful LTs towed groups of ferries and small tugs distributed among them. When the convoy left New York Harbor and moved across the ocean at only 4.5 knots, there was a dead calm at sea, but a week later, the barely plowing ships reached the storm zone. On September 26th, the wind speed reached 50 knots, and the small ST-7119, tumbled to starboard, was unable to level off. The crew of the bundled ST-718 was able to cut the rope to avoid being pulled into the abyss with their fellow ship. But the LT-492 that was pulling them did not react in time, and the tug's winch broke. 10 crew members of the sunken ST-719 were rescued. 2 sailors died. The tanker Maumee took on board the broken winch. It was repaired and reinstalled with a new cable, and then resumed towing. It was periodically necessary to send rescue parties on rubber dinghies to the ferries to repair towing connections and pump out flooded compartments. In the same way, food and drinking water had to be brought with great difficulty to the small tugs, which had no facilities for storing provisions. On October 10th, one of the ferries got a severe roll and had to be abandoned, despite the best efforts of the rescue team. On October 18th, the convoy entered the storm that ruined the 9th Landing Flotilla. When the wind speed reached hurricane 90 knots, ST-511 overturned and sank with the entire crew. and the sinking ST-720 managed to save 5 sailors. Since it was impossible to control the entire convoy, the Commodore divided it into groups, each of which was responsible for the destroyer escort. The escort and tugboat crews made every effort to bring the wards into port, but 7 more ferries were lost. Exhausted from a month-long voyage across the Atlantic, covering 3,724 miles at an average speed of 4 knots, Convoy NY-119 reached Falmouth on 19 October 1944, into whose harbor LCT-489, the sole survivor of the 9th Flotilla, arrived that same day. In all, 8 ferries, 6 lighters, and 3 tugs were lost, and 19 men were killed, all from the crews of the ST small tugs. Behind these dry lines of statistics remained the hardships described in 1973 by Charles D. Gibson, one of the participants in the crossing, who privately published, circulation 2,000 copies, the book The Trial for NY-119, the story of the strangest convoy of World War II. In the book, Gibson unvarnishedly described a very difficult situation on the tugs, including cases of panic. In the United States, the story of the convoy became famous, mainly because of the USS Mason, the first large warship to be crewed by mostly Black Americans. The destroyer brought its group as far as Falmouth before returning in the storm to search for the missing ships. During the storm, the Mason was severely damaged, had several main deck welds burst, which were hastily welded by their own efforts, lost all antennas, but the crew made every effort to find the lagging ships and bring them to port. Veterans of the destroyer claimed that they welded the deck at a roll of up to 70 degrees, while the British sloops, because of the terrible storm, gave up the search for the missing ships and went to the bases. Commodore of the convoy Alfred Lind in his report separately noted the merits of the destroyer, also pointing out that the British did not take risks, and petitioned to mark the entire crew with official letters of commendation from the Minister of the Navy with an entry in the personnel file. The surviving sailors of the nigger ship, as the Mason was disparagingly called in the Navy, received their commendations only in 1995. In 2004, a feature film, Proud, was made about the destroyer and its service, including participation in the convoy of NY-119. The story of convoys KMS-66 and NY-119 was a good example of how, in times of war, considerations of necessity become above all safety rules and common-sense notions of peacetime. War, like nature, has no bad weather, and sometimes people have only one thing left to do: just do their duty. Thank you for watching the video to the end. Forget to put a like and subscribe to the channel. It's important to me. See you soon.